when we started to discuss this year's forum, this topic for the forum, I suggested that we choose the UN and we have it as an overall topic. We could have all conversations about the United Nations. Not only because Sweden right now is a permanent member of the Security Council, or even because of next year's celebration of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, but because of the internal and external challenges this international body is facing. A body that once developed and still is developing the international rules around human rights that we adhere to. And I could see how we would discuss a number of issues, such as whether the Human Rights Council really is better than the old Human Rights Commission, looking into how the conventions were drafted, technicalities such as state party reporting to the treaty bodies and NGO participation. And I had all these other ideas. My colleagues thought, well, maybe not a full UN Human Rights Forum with 200 sessions about the United Nations. So I had to adapt a bit, but needless to say, I'm not a person to give in too easily or too much. I still want the spirit of the UN to guide us a little bit today when we have this high-level panel. Talking about the future of human rights, but also who will protect our rights in the future. The question, of course, arises from the situation we see around us today, where human rights, as described in the Universal Declaration, in practice, however well developed in theory, are not always respected and sometimes blatantly ignored. Whether all over the world there's a nationalistic tendency to reduce human rights to citizens' rights at the best, and a world where, in fact, horrendous violations occur, violations that the world community cannot, or perhaps will not, stop. Against this background, we will use this session to discuss the UN, but also talk about other international actors than the UN. Organizations once created by states with the purpose of promoting human rights, bodies that for some time now have also faced challenges, like the European Court for Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission, the African Court for Human and People's Rights, and of course the Permanent International Criminal Court. We will look at the problems that exist when it comes to protecting universal human rights, if there are ongoing reforms, and not least to discuss if we need changes and what will they be. Do we actually need new institutions to protect our rights in the future? When the old ones are not functioning as we want them to? We will, in all this, of course, remember that it is the nation states that are the duty bearers, but also remember that there are other non-state actors today who have a huge impact on human rights. How can we control their behavior? We might also dare to discuss if human rights have come to an end, because this is something that actually is being discussed today. And for discussing these issues, we have an excellent panel with huge knowledge and experience to help us, guide us through the problems and challenges, and also perhaps solutions for protecting human rights in the future. We have Joy Ngozi-Etselo, who is a human rights law professor from Nigeria and also an international expert on human trafficking and violence against women. Bill Pace, who is the convener of the NGO Coalition for the International Criminal Court and also Secretary General for the World Federalist Movement. Rolf Kühnemann, who was one of the founders of FIAN, Food First International Information Action Network, now a human rights director for the organization, and also working on some very exciting new events developing around transnational companies and how we control them. And also, of course, here to my left, Hans Corell, who is the former Under-Secretary General for the UN and Legal Director for the Foreign Ministry. The outline of this discussion will be as follows. All participants will be giving short presentations for about 10 minutes. I will not open up for comments or questions other than just clarifications after each presentation. And then we will have comments from the panel to what has just been said, questions from me, and questions from the audience by the end of the session. I hope you all agree to that outline. Thank you so much for coming, and please give the panel a welcome applause to us. So without further ado, I give the floor to Joy, who will start off with her presentation. Would you like to sit where you are, or would you like to stand? That's fine.
I can stand. Yeah. Thank you so much. Good morning, all. I bring you greetings from Nigeria and from Africa. And I hope maybe there are other people from Africa here. Really, the topic of this high-level panel is who will protect our future of our human rights. You want me to? I think I can stay here.
Yeah.
Or do you want me? Yeah. Who will protect the future, protect our human rights in the future? I would like to invite all of you to join me in this debate or conversation, because I would like it to be a conversation. And because this is important, especially if we look at human rights as a right that all of us have as human beings, which has been around, you can guess what? Probably from as long as the universe. So it's been been around since the universe. So not wondering why it's called universal human rights. But we are concerned about modern human rights. Modern human rights that started earnestly at the end of Second World War. At the end of Second World War, that's where the movement for human rights, after the atrocities committed at the war, the world said, never again. And then we saw the demise of the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, and they came up with the United Nations Charter. And the Charter, the 1945 Charter, stated clearly that one of its purposes will be promotion and protection of human rights. And not just that, it said that they set the standard for equality and non-discrimination, to say that no one should be discriminated against on grounds of sex, race, color, religion, or language. And therefrom, it also said importantly that members of United Nations can take action jointly and severally to protect human rights. So that's the beginning of the right that we're talking about. So just know that it's right that inheres in us because we are human beings. So when we are talking about it, that means that all of us have a stake in the future of that human right. And the future of that human right is for all of us to protect. And that is my thesis. So again, when we talk about human rights, we look at it from the universal conception of human rights. So if human rights is universal, people have argued human rights, the natural rights, from legal point of view, from moralist. But if you say human rights is universal, just know that also others who said human rights is not universal, that is relativist. So you have this debate, universalist and relativist debate around human rights. And then also when we look at human rights, we also talk about categorization of human rights, the civil and political right. Which one is most important? First generation of human right, the second generation of human right, socioeconomic and cultural rights. And during the Cold War, it was that maybe that's why some thought human right was Western conception, that you have to look at it, civil and political right was emphasized over socioeconomic right, which then the Soviet Union was also promoting as part of socialist agenda. And then it reflected in development of normative framework that United Nations started with. Because first we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then we moved on to have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. The first one, the first ever proclamation on the rights and freedom of men and women that Anna mentioned, will be commemorating the 70th anniversary next year, was adopted in 1948. It was a declaration. In law, we say it belongs to soft international law because it's not legally binding. Thereafter, we had the two covenants, and together they formed the pillar, what we call the Bill of Rights in international law. And the two covenants are binding, but then the division in terms of focus on implementation of it was also part of the history of human rights and the politics of human rights. So that we were talking about categorization of rights, that we were talking about what rights should take preeminence, then that we also were debating which one that the state will protect. But then we had the world conferences, and then we had the World Conference in 1993 in Vienna. And after that conference, it seemed to have laid to rest the issue around whether human rights is universal or culturally relative. And that's when the program of action in paragraph 5 said, all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. That the international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. While the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds must be borne in mind, it is the duty of states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural system, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And that's one of my favorite paragraphs. And it is the same for many, because then we thought that the world has united, come together to protect human rights for our future. So that what led to the modern human right, to the UN Charter in 1945, will never be forgotten. So, we know by 1993 and to date, we've had several international instruments, some legally binding, what we call treaties, some belonging to what we call soft international law, but there's numerous that at a stage people are asking, don't we have enough standard setting? Can't we just stop the standard setting and shift focus to implementation, to enforcement? Because we now have major treaties, not only covering the human rights, but covering specific rights, rights of women, rights of children, rights of persons with disability, migrant rights, refugees' rights, all of that. So we said, let us focus a bit about implementation. 17 years down the line, can we say that human right is one that have been realized by all? What can we say about government's obligation to protect, to respect, and to remedy human rights? To what extent have that been enforced? So when you look at that, that's why I call the title of my presentation, From Rhetorics, Realization of Human Rights, from rhetorics to collective action. It will take a collective. It will take demand that will raise accountability stake for those standards to be implemented. If we look at the world is standing on different, everyone is on different, some will call it different universals. It's not the same for us. In some places, and in my part of the world, we are talking of basic, very basic human rights and recognition of those basic human rights, including right to life, including means to that life, because we moved away from saying that states should refrain from acting negative to taking positive action. What are the means to that life? What about food, health, access to healthcare, right to shelter? All of that are things we are grappling with in many developing countries, including mine, Nigeria, where I come from. So when you look at the enforcement mechanism at the UN is a major site for discussions around human rights. That's how it started. If you look at it, they have already system that they built over these past 70 years for enforcement of human rights. But the most important system now, you will talk about UN Human Rights Council, which is in Geneva, Switzerland, and is the one that is charged with implementation of those, monitoring and observation of those treaties, and it replaced the then UN Commission on Human Rights. Of course, we have the General Assembly, the Third Committee, we have the Security Council, and all of that. But then within the UN Human Rights Council, it complements the work of the UN General Assembly and Security Council. It is one that have institutionalized different enforcement mechanisms, starting from confidential procedure 1503 to 2035 that can be taken in any part of the world, to special procedure mandate holders that are independent experts of the UN that can even go undertake country missions, report to United Nations, help in implementation to make sure that human rights gets to the people, have meaning at national and at municipal level. I served as one of those UN experts. In that capacity, I had a thematic focus, mandate, of being a UN Special Rapporteur on trafficking in persons, especially women and children, between 2008 and 2014. And in that capacity, you can see the way our work helped to bring about realization of human rights. And because we have our independence, and because we're not paid by the UN, so we can say things the way it is, and these are mechanisms, different mechanisms that complement even treaty-based bodies as well that talk about human rights. So, again, I know we don't have time, but I said, whatever we stop is a conversation. So, what I'm looking at is we've advanced to universal periodic reporting, where states even report themselves, other stakeholders participate in that, and their peers judge them that are state and say, you're doing well here, you're not doing well here, this is this, and the state come up and say, I will accept this recommendation, I will not accept this, and then he said, let's work together to make sure that we achieve that universal human right. And then I would like, within the few minutes or 3 minutes available to me, to talk about where is Africa? Because when we talk about international human rights, we talk also about regional system. And the beauty of it is even the United Nations Charter said, this charter cannot prevent any regional arrangement that still promotes the cause of UN. So we are working towards Congress. We are working towards concerted action, cooperation between international and regional system. And in Africa, of course, we have normative framework. We have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We have the African Charter on Rights of the Child. We have the African Charter, the Maputo Protocol, the Protocol on the Rights of Women. So we have also enough standard setting, but implementation is fraught with difficulties. That is where we have a problem. People are still talking about basic human rights. And we are still at the level of democratization. Many states in Africa talking about democratization, emergent constitution, constitutionalism. And we are doing this in a world today that is challenged by religious fundamentalism, by terrorism, by different conflicts of different nature, by contentions around even human rights, whether people of sexual minorities or different sexual orientation who have their rights respected. One of my colleagues, I'm going straight from here to South Africa, for another institute we're running on litigation on women's rights cases. And one of the founders of this organization who used to work with Interright in London, that did a lot of work, Hans, he told me, of course, you also was in Abuja Commonwealth Judges Forum, and they did a lot of brilliant work. Recently, she was arrested in Tanzania. And what was the offense? They gathered to discuss sexual and reproductive health rights. And the government said, no, they came to talk about LGBT rights, and that is against their law. And they rounded them up and they detained them. These are issues about rights. These are issues about human rights defenders. How far has state gone in implementation of this right? There is a rise in sovereignty. States are reasserting even sovereignty as we speak. People are in quest for self-determination. Even in my own part of the world where I come from, there is independent people of Biafra looking for independence in Spain. You see what is happening, and you see how heavily handed states are coming down. And we're talking about human rights standard. How do we build cooperation between the UN and other regional mechanisms? And these are what we'll be talking later. So again, in trying to conclude, I would say, there are gaps. And I identified 5 A's. I like alphabet because it makes it very clear to me. Accountability, obligation to protect, respect, and remedy rests primarily on the states. But we have to keep raising that accountability stake by demand. Action, lack of positive action and lack of willingness on the part of states, including non-state actors, to respect human rights. We've had cases I've handled on pro bono basis where enterprises say, look, human rights doesn't sit on our board. We are not government. We shouldn't protect human rights. And we talk about business and we talk of profit. Awareness. How come 70 years down the line, people are still not aware, they cannot recognize and respond to violation of their human rights? Ability of citizens to access justice. Justice is very crucial. Access to resources, when we talk about human rights, to build the capacity, they're all lacking. So moving forward, what do we do? I conclude by saying, do we need a world court? We have already International Court of Justice. We have ICC, we have treaty bodies, including Human Rights Committee. In Africa, we already have the African Court for Human Rights. We have the African Commission on Human Rights. I ask, when can state interfere for gross violation of human rights? Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter. In promotion of that charter, it said universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or color, or religion. All members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of that Article 55. There shouldn't be any safe haven for impunity for violation of human rights. The role of civil society is clear. Human rights defenders need to be protected. Role of national human rights institutions come clear here. So my conclusion is that it will take a collective for the realization of human rights to materialize. The future of human rights is in our hands. States, non-state, and private enterprise. It's not just state, even though states have primary responsibility. State can't go it alone, and we can't just expect that sometime the state that is the violator, that have all interest not to implement, will be at the driving seat. We make sure they drive, but we will be there as conscious passengers. Most violations are taking place in private domain. What do? So it is imperative that we improve cooperation between global and regional human rights mechanisms and urgently address implementation of the gaps and challenges. Together and through collective action, we can chart the future for human rights, to be enjoyed by all, to have meaning to all, wherever you're located. Even in the remotest part of the world that cannot be seen on any map, just like, if I'm to paraphrase Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chair of the first ever Declaration of Human Rights. He said, unless human rights have meaning, in that remotest part of the world, community that cannot be seen on a map, it will have no meaning anywhere in the world. And that is where I stopped and I said, I stand up for human rights. And I want you to stand up for human rights as well. Working together, we can take our future, take the future of human rights in our hands. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy. You can see this subject is something that actually is quite important to all of us to discuss, and we have a lot of comments to your. A lot of comments from the panel, but we'll leave that for later. But you mentioned that you talk a lot about the implementation that is lacking, and perhaps with that will bring us to the question of rule of law, which I think you will talk about a bit in your presentation, Hans.
Yes, thank you. Could I ask the audience, do you hear properly? I think there's a strange echo in the room. Can you hear?
Yes.
You can. Very good. Now, as you heard, there are plenty of international instruments regulating human rights. But I have a core element here, because if that element is not present, you can forget about the realization of these rights. And that concept is the rule of law. I am a judge by profession. I served actually for 10 years as a judge in this region of Sweden before I came to the ministries and later to the United Nations as his legal counsel. And I'm very disappointed, to tell you the truth, at the United Nations members that they do not stand up for the requirement of the rule of law. All these conventions mentioned here, they are extremely important. But also you can go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. When that declaration was adopted by the General Assembly, it was not binding, it was just a resolution. But over the years, this declaration has acquired something called customary international law. This means that the declaration today is binding on all states, also on states that have not ratified the conventions mentioned here. What do I mean then by the rule of law? Well, I use 4 very simple elements to describe it. There are many descriptions, but I think if you focus on these 4 elements, then you understand better what is required. The first is democracy. Democracy because it is necessary for the second element. The second element is proper legislation that respects and implements the international law, in particular in the field of human rights, because human rights is a core element in the rule of law. And to have a proper legislation, you need a legitimate legislator. And a legitimate legislator you can basically find only in a democracy where the legislative assembly is elected by the people. Then you have a third element, and that I have my own experience, having been brought up, as it were, in the Swedish judiciary, the institutions to administer this law, and in particular, impartial and independent courts. And I saw this as a young law clerk, how the senior judges went about their daily work in the courts here in Småland. That gave an impression that never left me. And it was extremely important to have this in my backbone when I served as a UN legal counsel. There could be coming ambassadors saying, well, we have instructions from our capital and we expect that the legal office will do this and that. And I could say, well, Ambassador, I'm listening to you, but you can be assured of one thing. I make my own decisions. This is my duty, based on the best analysis I can do with my staff of the applicable law in the issue question at issue. This was the third element. And now I come to the fourth element, maybe the most difficult of them all. The persons, the individuals, with the knowledge and the integrity to administer these institutions. And here you see in many countries that there is not this knowledge, or in particular, there is not this integrity. And in many countries there is corruption. And one of the worst enemies of the rule of law is corruption. So these were the 4 elements that I use when I explain the rule of law. And if you ask me, if I look around the world at conflicts anywhere in the world and put the question, why is there a conflict? The answer is always the same. Because there's no democracy, there is no rule of law. That is a recipe for conflict. And this is why it is so important that the United Nations actually apply the rule of law. And the General Assembly has adopted resolutions with resounding support for the idea of the rule of law. And yet we see organs of the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, sometimes violating these fundamental rules. I'll come back to that a little later. I would just like to, because we only have 7 minutes for the introduction, I think we agreed on that, I will keep to that time, that I will focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, there are 17 goals, and I'm sure that they are discussed here at Mänskliga Rättighetsdagarna, the Human Rights Forum here. One of these goals is Goal 16, which talks about equal justice for all, and it has 2 very specific targets, rule of law and anti-corruption. This is the core, in my view, among the 17 principles. I would suggest that if you do not achieve Goal 16 with the rule of law, then it will be very difficult to realize the other goals. And this is our duty for the future to do so. So I would like to say also that just one example when I talk about the United Nations Security Council, in particular the permanent 5 members. If they do not take the lead, they are sending a terrible signal around the world that they apply the law when it suits their interests, instead of bowing to the law and Article 24 in the UN Charter, where they have an obligation with imperatives to be the main responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. And yet, we see permanent members of the Security Council flagrantly violating the very law they are set to supervise, namely the UN Charter. The attack on Iraq back in 2003 by the UK and the US was a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. The same goes for the attack on Georgia in 2008, and now the latest here on Ukraine and Crimea. These are flagrant violations of the UN Charter. Now, to end up, the UN Charter was elaborated by a generation that had experienced 2 world wars. The same goes for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We should respect that. We should respect the wisdom that they attempted to transfer to us and not bow to the attempts today to, shall we say, sneak around the corner and not apply the rules that were elaborated here. This is the only way forward if we want to achieve peace and security in the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hans. And we will, of course, have questions for you as well later. And this brings me to Bill and some of the resolutions and decisions that have been taken in the UN that you've been following very closely. So I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, good morning. And hello way up there at the top. Human rights are not written in the stars. They are, as to borrow an analogy from a famous world citizen, they are like marble monuments in a desert of shifting sands. And without our daily individual attention to wiping the sand away, they could be lost with the very next storm. And we have experienced some of those storms in the last 100 years. And they could be lost for many generations. So the subject that Ordfront and the Swedish Forum have asked us to address this morning, I think, is extremely important. Who will protect our human rights in the future? I'm going to, in my brief opening comments, first say who we cannot rely on, who isn't going to help us protect our human rights. Dictatorships, extreme nationalists, racists and supremacists, religious extremists, anti-immigration movements, anti-refugee movements. Unfortunately, much of the media in the world. The international financial institutions and the private sector will not help in this unless they are forced to by international and supranational laws. Much of the foreign policy elites in this world are not going to help us. They are guided by a realpolitik that is willing to sacrifice human rights. Intentional and sometimes just misguided media, academics, donors who buy into a divide and conquer approaches to these questions. Those who continue to separate development from human rights and to pit human rights against development. And as Hans mentioned, unfortunately, the permanent members of the Security Council. Who do I think will protect our human rights in the future? Well, the national constitutions and institutions that embrace universal human rights and minority rights. The international constitutions or charters, the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and institutions that embrace universal human rights that are inclusive of civil and political, but also the economic and social rights and cultural rights. The extraordinary human rights legal order that has been developed in the last 70 years, including the norms like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the responsibility to protect. Fundamental to protecting future rights will be international organizations, and particular regional international organizations, their laws and their institutions. The European Union is foremost in the development of these structures, but the African Union is proceeding, the Organization of American States has important developments that have occurred. And now we see sub-regional organizations taking major steps, like the West African ECOWAS. Then, of course, the transnational institutions. There are very few, but the International Criminal Court is preeminent amongst these, as is, in my mind, the European Court of Human Rights as transnational. Crucial to this will be and of great importance will be the global cross-sectoral coalitions of non-governmental organizations, of global civil society, and coalitions of governments that go across regional lines, that are trans-regional. With the complete and utter paralysis of the UN Security Council, we must continue to rely much more on the UN General Assembly, which has actually produced most of the great laws and institutions in the last 70 years. The Economic and Social Council of the UN, its subsidiary bodies, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2015 to 2030 plan, I think, is one of the great achievements. It also was an achievement of this coalition on small and middle power governments that Sweden very often is part of. Over 110, 120 governments now, I think, are willing to move forward on kind of enforcement of the norms of the UN Charter and international law, but there still are 60 or 70 governments that are not going along with this. The governments that oppose the misuse of the veto are strong supporters of protecting human rights. And those governments who want to reform the Security Council, especially in how it operates and its very dysfunctional working methods. Those who embrace human security over state security. And increasingly, I think, those who are going to protect human rights are those who are the advocates of the women, peace, and security sector. Overarching issue to me on this question is whether we're going to continue in a world in which it is governed by the rule by law instead of the rule of law. Are we going to finally get to a point where the international community will do human rights, enforce human rights law and humanitarian law, or will it only continue to be able to react to catastrophic failures? And unfortunately, that I think is the most important question for this next generation, your generation going forward. Last couple of comments. One is that we live in bubbles, basically. Those of us who work on international and national human rights are a very small bubble in the world. I think this extraordinary forum, and it's, I think, unique in the world in many ways, has 1,000 participants. But if my understanding is correct, there's about 8 million people in Sweden?
9.
Pardon? 10 million, which is even better. So 1 in 1,000. You're 1 in 1,000th of at this conference. And that's actually much bigger than the real bubble in the world. So the entire structure is based upon a very small constituency of people. And the good news about that is how much a few people can do and achieve. Those who put together the Rome Statute, I figure in total amounted to 3,000 or 4,000 lawyers mostly, and non-governmental representatives over a 6-year period or so. So that's 3,000 or 4,000 out of at that time 6 or 7 billion people. So that is my real message also about how we can protect the future. And I will leave with another great historian's comment that history is this race between education and catastrophe. And it is forums like this that I think are one of the great hopes for protecting the future of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we'll continue actually directly with Rolf. Did you have slides? Show? Do you need?
Oh, do you want me to pass it on to him?
Yeah, if he wants to.
Excuse me. Do you use it?
No, I think she'll do it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. It's my third Human Rights Days, and they're getting better always, so congratulations. I would like to talk a little bit from the experience of working with FIAN International as a human rights organization on the right to food and nutrition, and start with that we actually can be happy and proud that a lot has been achieved in the past. So we have heard a lot from all three panelists so far on institutions that have been in place, so it's a very biased short summary that you'll see here. We mentioned the Second World Conference on Human Rights that was really, I think, a big step forward. Also because it established the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, that has a crucial role in the UN human rights system, and I was one of those in 1993 fighting for it. So I'm very happy to come here and say, hey, that was something we achieved. And yeah, the other issue I was fighting for was more human rights ideas in the FAO. So that was also achieved in 2004 with the Right to Food guidelines, so that the FAO, as actually all intergovernmental organizations should do, base their work on human rights, right? Rather than on anything else, we know what else. So I'm not mentioning that now. 2011, the Maastricht Principles on Extraterritorial Obligations of States. That's what the ETO there says, extraterritorial obligations of states, so that we overcome the situation that human rights are trapped in the silos of domestic law, or in the silo, let's say, of the territory of a state, but domestic law is opened up also to certain obligations outside the territory of a state. And in the world that we are living now, that is extremely important. So that has to do with international law, but also with changing domestic law, taking into consideration the realities. I'll come back to that. The optional protocol on economic, social, cultural rights, Joy, you had mentioned that it is finally there that we are moving towards justiciability of economic, social, cultural rights with this protocol. After 20 years of struggle, we got this protocol. And I think the role of civil society had also been mentioned, was crucial in getting that. I mean, the experience is you don't get anything unless you struggle for it. Okay, a civil society, let's be as clear as that. Let me mention the Vienna Plus 20 declaration. That was 20 years after the Vienna Second World Conference, a big gathering of civil society organizations that actually triggered this celebrations there in Vienna. The states came afterwards. It was the civil society that was said, hey, it's 20 years now. And for me, the specific, I mean, there was this declaration that you can download and so on. I won't go into this, but for me, the special experience there was, first of all, that social movements started to get on the human rights train. That was a difficulty until then, that human rights was kind of alienated from the social movement struggle, except traditionally, of course, the workers, who have always been putting forward the human rights issue, at least one sector of it. Another important achievement in 2014, just 3 years ago, is the establishment of an intergovernmental working group by the HRC, the Human Rights Council. We have heard about it. A intergovernmental working group to draft a human rights treaty on TNCs and related business. So that is now applying basically the obligation of states to protect human rights against business activities, especially transnational business activities, as they are cross-border and extremely powerful. And to establish this instrument was also a tremendous struggle against the vested interests and the states who are actually were out there and are out there to protect TNC interests. One other positive element, the human right to food continues to be integrated in more and more national constitutions. The national constitutions are absolutely key for the rule of law and for human rights. Without having these in constitutions, we can forget about human rights. And let me get back shortly to the history of human rights. Human rights got a big step forward after the World War, the Second World War, with their human rights establishments internationally. But where do they come from? They come from the liberation struggles of the people in the United States and in France in those days to establish their own sovereignty. And for me, human rights have much to do with sovereignty. Actually, they operationalize the sovereignty of people towards the states, right? I mean, if you give up human rights, you give up your sovereignty and vice versa. Can we go on? So that was the positive side. Now comes the other side. The ground is shaky. We have two big states that are outside the International Bill of Human Rights. And it's China and the USA. And there's a continuing work going on to change that. Another element that is really worrying is what we call corporate capture at FIAN and in other organizations. It is the growing, decisive corporate influence in public decision-making. We have the revolving doors, the multi-stakeholderism, the co-funding of international institutions that all go into a direction that undermines the sovereignty of people and their representatives in national and international fora. Well, you see certain points, I won't go into that, on financialization, the financial crisis, the impossibility actually to govern over those banks. Everybody knows that the regulation, everybody had been talking about regulation, but it's going on the same way or worse as it was. And some people were in the United States open enough to say that we can't govern them anymore. Then I ask, where is people's sovereignty? Where are people's human rights if these institutions cannot be governed any longer, if they are too big to be governed over by states? We have worrying developments at the United Nations. The Global Compact is hailed in many respects, but actually it opened the door of transnational corporations into the human rights system. So I can go into details here. This is not a positive development. This is undermining the human rights system. We have a further sidelining of the United Nations and international policy by the so-called Global Redesign Initiative of the World Economic Forum. It says, okay, let's, in some of the key policy issues, states don't do it. States multilateralism doesn't deliver. We have to replace this by multi-stakeholders with corporations, states, and civil society around the table. I think it's a terrible idea, and we have to fight it. It has to do also with something like institutional corruption. That is a term that I took actually from Harvard studies who analyzed actually, are these institutions still operating? Hans has mentioned the issue of corruption. The problem is it's not only a personal problem. Corruption, we think of bribery. It is that the institution itself, as they're set up and are functioning, are corrupt. So, last issue from this year, there has been in May a landmark public-private partnership of Microsoft with the Office of the High Commissioner. And as I have been involved in struggling, you can imagine that was very, harmful and I think for me it was a shock to see that, just coming out in notice that Microsoft has contributed $5 million to the Office of the High Commissioner, and they have entered into some kind of agreement that the High Commissioner refused to make public. So actually I'm not very interested in that agreement. I'm interested to ask you and us and all of us, I mean, is this something that we would admit internationally or not? I mean, for FIAN and many others, it's clear we won't, no matter what the agreement is. And the High Commissioner said that he hoped that this would be just the first step. So the question is, who is next after Microsoft? So we are currently in contact with the High Commissioner's office and trying to make clear that this is a step in the wrong direction, and we hope it can be addressed. We also talked about this in the Human Rights Council with the states. Can we go? So what's the way forward? I think the human rights movement has to get much more political than it is. I mean, it's not about experts getting together and talking about international law and all that. Unless you struggle, and that is a political struggle, not a party political struggle, but a struggle for the sovereignty, for your own sovereignty and the sovereignty of your people. Unless we do that, we will be overrun by the forces that are currently at work. So movements should converge, and we definitely have to dismantle corporate power. We have to do it now because it's growing through financialization. It is growing every day, and the sooner we stop this, the better. That has to do with education. We have mentioned that several times on this panel. Avoiding some fallacies also about human rights. It's not states that generate human rights. States generate human rights law, yes, but human rights are generated by the struggle of the people, right? So we have to maintain that. Human rights are also not values. Human rights are rights. And it sounds trivial, but it's not, because in international parlance, increasingly the reference, especially of corporate sector and so on, to human rights is a value language, a moral language, and that drives us back into the Middle Ages of natural law, right? Where it's not about sovereignty of the people and the rule of law anymore. It is about just values. Human rights are not. Yes, I think what is next? Currently, the third session of the Intergovernmental Working Group on T&Cs and other business and human rights is proposing as one option an international court on T&Cs. So that would mean establishing international obligations of T&Cs and bring them to court. Not human rights obligations of T&Cs. There is quite a bit of confusion, even in the human rights community. T&Cs don't have human rights obligations, states have them, separately and jointly. T&Cs have obligations in international law that are derived from protect obligations, and the term that we should use on what they do to human rights sometimes, some of them, not all of them, but sometimes, is crime. That is the term. And so the question is, expand the ICC, International Criminal Court, or go for a separate court. So currently its tendency is going for a separate court. How about the Third World Conference of Human Rights that was raised a couple of years ago in Vienna +20? World Court of Human Rights, a difficult one. So because, yeah, we can get into this perhaps rather than saying that. So I have some mixed feeling about this, but in general I'm in favor for that. What we need to do is cover some areas of human rights that are important but are not covered yet. And one of them is to establish human rights or recognize human rights of future generations. I mean, we are currently destroying the livelihoods of future generations, for all we know scientifically, with our system that is currently running. The people whose lives are destroyed currently by our generations are not alive. How do we make sure that their human rights exist and can in fact be made justiciable? And finally, we have to strengthen extraterritorial obligations that are somewhere in the middle between relying too much on international obligations in international law and domestic law. And that is also on the way. So that's another positive point. The General Comment 24 recently has moved in this direction, and we will have this afternoon another workshop on the extraterritorial obligations, and these are the Maastricht principles that summarize what international law talks and has about extraterritorial obligations. You're all invited at 2:30 in K10. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will let you comment on each other's presentations, but from what I hear, there's both a question about the proliferation of standard settings and that there are so many, and you need to go, like you mentioned, Joy, we need to look at the basic principles and see how they are implemented in reality, and that they actually, that the rule of law and pacta sunt servanda, that when you have an agreement, you should honor it. That is something that needs to be strengthened in the human rights system, so as far as I understand from you. And at the same time, we see new developments and the need for new standard settings, for new situations in the world. Would anyone, how will we sort of juggle this? How will this work in the future to both go back and look at basic principles and also develop human rights principles for the situations that we see in the world today, for example, with transnational corporations? Would anyone like to comment?
Yeah. I think, yes, we have enough standards. Yes, we can even say, okay, let us stop. It's not out of order to say, let us take a deep breath, look at the extant law. We have huge, haven't they, the existing law cover almost everything? One of the things I like is when you look at the principles of equality and non-discrimination, if we give true meaning to it and interpret it, you will see that it covers every other thing as a guiding principle. Before we move on to the issue of principle of justice, the principle of rule of law, the twin pillars of rule of law, issues around, you must hear everybody, they are all protected as civil and political rights. Having an impartial, competent judiciary where people can assess justice. I wouldn't say that the world, the UN or any regional body should stop setting standards, because there are issues emerging and there are different forms, but broadly speaking, we should focus more on implementation, because the problem now is even the resources to implement what we already have. And that is why the UN, in exploring new partnership, in a bid to encourage public-private partnership, because governments are not putting their money where their mouth is on human rights. They are beginning to partner with the corporations. If you look at the concept of sovereignty, sovereignty is a concept in transition, because some of these corporations are even more powerful than states. Some of them are richer than many states put together. And if you look at the relationship, it's increasingly becoming a relationship of a giant and a dwarf. So they are powerful. The UN can't put money, the UN member state can't contribute to ensure enforcement of human rights. So the High Commissioner goes hand in hand looking for where they can get money to fund even work on human rights. I recall, as the UN expert, independent expert on trafficking, you know hugely how every country is affected by trafficking. Human trafficking knows no border. And we talk about it being a $35 billion worth of business. And then when you look at the total budget within the UN for fighting trafficking, you're talking of few millions. Then, are we serious enough? So we shouldn't commit resources. We should put resources, place priority in enforcement, in implementation of the existing normative framework, avoid reinventing the wheel, see how maybe we can use because I believe within what is existing, it virtually covers everything. Yes, there may be new situations that will require, we can do it by resolution. The Security Council is there, they still do other ways, but the resources that goes into writing a new laws or getting to talk about this and organize global conferences around it and regional is a lot. So the focus should be implementation, and how to have resources from the right people, not tainted resources, in order to make sure that we hold state, the primary duty bearers, to account.
If I could
Yes.
add on this from my point of view. I think the implementation issue, and I have two aspects of it I want to quickly address. One is the resources. The entire United Nations system, which is 34 agencies, programs, the UN Security Council, the chemical weapons, the energy, World Food Program, the whole system is about 45 billion euros. You divide that by 7+ billion people, we're spending around 6.5 euros per person on this planet per year to deal with these global governance issues. It is an outrage how little this. 1/3 of that is assessed funding of governments. 1/3 of it that they have to pay as a treaty obligation. 2/3 is voluntary funding. 90% of the 2/3 is voluntary funding that is specified, that is earmarked. So if the U.S. Is going to give funds to the World Health or World Food Organization, it's U.S. crops, it's U.S. ships, it's all of this. The way we're funding multilateralism is not sustainable. It's a fraud. And if you listen to the ones, the divide and conquer elites who say, oh, it's this giant, wasteful bureaucracy, it's simply not accurate, just factually incorrect. And so we're not going to have implementation if we don't change the way we fund this work at the African Union level or at the OAS level or at the UN level, however you want to deal with it. Then the second point I want to make on implementation is to separate the norm or the law from the way it's implemented. That just because the international community doesn't implement something correct doesn't mean that the law or the norm or the standard is wrong. And yet the two are often mixed up and criticized. And so the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court is one of the greatest advances in international law in all of history. Unbelievable advance. It could never be repeated at this point. Today it couldn't have been repeated a year before it happened. It hit a very extraordinary moment in 1998 that it was approved. The law is pretty great. How it's implemented has a lot to be desired. And that difference in the implementation I wanted to make. So.
Hans wanted to comment and then Rob.
Thank you. I agree entirely. I'd just like to raise two issues here. First of all, you talked about who is responsible for implementing human rights and so forth. And I think it's very important to point to civil society. This has to come from the grassroots level. I have one single picture. Could I have that one on the screen now? Where is the operator? I have one single picture. Could you please set that up?
Om du går tillbaka till den första bilden och så är det bild 2.
It should be a cover. Rule of law, a guide for politicians, is it that? Är det den?
Jag ser inte här, det kommer inte upp.
Jag ser inte.
Det kommer inte upp någonting.
Kommer inte upp någonting?
Jo,
Men du lovade ju att du skulle kunna visa bilden.
Den är nästa bild på den. Den.
Där kommer det. Right, I would like to point to one very important element, and this is advice from former heads of state and government that gathered in 2008 to discuss strengthening the respect for international law. And we had a preliminary meeting in Hamburg, and present were Helmut Schmidt, Malcolm Fraser from Australia, Jean Chrétien from Canada, and Ingvar Carlsson from Sverige. And I was asked to advise them, and when I started talking about the rule of law, all of a sudden Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, softly asked, 90 years old then, I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law. And this is precisely the thing. Rule of law is not for lawyers only. On the contrary, it has to come from the society. And in particular, the politicians have to know about this. In particular, I would say, if they are sitting on the legislative assembly of the country. So therefore, this idea gave us an idea that we elaborated this guide, which is available now in only some 40 pages, freely on the web for downloading and printing in 24 languages. So I advise you to take down these words, rule of law, a guide for politicians, and you will find it immediately. My second comment concerns the Security Council. There have been several references to the Council here, and I am adamant about the reform of the Council. The only thing they are discussing really is to add more members to the Council. The Council is an executive organ. Already 15 members is a lot. And therefore, I have issued articles under the title Security Council Reform, Rule of Law more important than additional members. And I think this is a crucial element here, that we organize the working methods, and I think William Bill Pace was discussing this, and in particular that they do not use the veto unless their own, very own security concerns are on the table, not just patting some friend on the back and using the veto there as they do. And actually students at Uppsala has started a campaign under the title Stop the Illegitimate Vetoes campaign. And I think this is something that should be spread around the world, that we can't see this, because then what's the point in having the council that doesn't work when it is really needed? Thank you. And my webpage, by the way, just Google my name and you will find my webpage, and there you can find these articles if you're interested. Thank you.
Rolf, you wanted also to say a few words about this?
Yeah, about implementation. One of the fastest growing areas of international law over the last decades has been international commercial law. There are thousands of treaties that have been established, and they have implementation. There is an international system in place that actually is a heavy burden on the sovereignty of states. They have to accept to be sued by corporations before international treaties. So now that, the first question is, why do give states away our security as the people to such international organs? I would understand if this would be international human rights treaties, and we are dealing with international human rights bodies adjudicating. So that would be the only, for me, justification to give away some sovereignty, but that is not happening. And coming back to the treaty process, sitting there and seeing how the EU, the USA, Australia, and so on try to prevent a treaty that is, in my eyes, completely harmless compared to the commercial law and the power that commercial law, now international commercial law, gives to corporations over all of us, and it is implemented in billions of dollars against our own tax money. You will see that we have lost quite a bit of our sovereignty. And of course that starts with states allowing to be emasculated financially. Financialization takes away sovereignty from the people and from states. And we have to get this into the picture of human rights as well.
So why is that? You said the completely harmless conventions and resolutions. What regarding human rights that these states don't want to touch, more or less? Even if they do ratify, they don't implement.
Thank you.
So what is the problem? Why are human rights so dangerous? For many states? How would you explain that?
Well, I think to go back to 1993. We were involved with that World Conference. The Western group opposed having the conference. It was the developing countries that wanted the conference. The main reason the Western group, and I'm thinking now more of the US, the UK, etc., was they were worried that economic rights were going to get advanced and political rights they thought they would go backwards on. Fortunately, they couldn't stop it because it was convened by the Assembly, and there was this very important proposal to create this position of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but it turned out to be quite, I think, a tremendously effective conference that way. So a lot of it has to do with the fear about economic rights and increasing the social net. And how do you deal with this unbelievable transfer of power to the 1% and the inequalities in this world if you don't deal with them legally? And we do need to deal with them legally, but I think, unfortunately, the whole issue of the reason Zaid, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is taking money from Microsoft is because his budgets is getting hit. And we're going to move down this path of where, okay, now we're going to fund human rights with voluntary funding, and there's going to be a quid pro quo on that. So it is it's a scandal. And I forgot to mention a minute ago when I mentioned that the entire UN system is about 45 billion euros a year. We're spending, I think it's the Swedish International Peace Institute, we spend over 1,000 billion on weapons and war. And that's an underestimate. So 48 versus 1,000, and you wonder why peace and security is losing out to the forces of chaos and violence. So the numbers do make a big difference, and the ones that are protecting that they don't want to have financial obligations, that's a part of who we have to challenge and convince that to save this planet, we're going to have to spend more resources on all of the root causes of war.
I just have a question for Rudolph, because he mentioned this important point. We all know about the issue of the global redesign initiative. Do you think it's something that is taken away from the global compact? Because when we talked about the global compact, human rights and businesses, many people latched onto it. In fact, even as the special rapporteur on trafficking, I also organized, as part of holding the private sector to account and ensuring that they are part of the process of ensuring a trafficking-free supply chain. We also had businesses talk about ending human trafficking within the businesses and the role of businesses in it, and having like ethical codes and all of that. Don't you see that they can also have a World Economic Forum, some contribution to make in terms of popularizing human rights in businesses? Instead of, is there any way we can look at it positively? Because we are emphasizing, even at state level, public-private partnership as the way to go. And when we're talking of future of human rights, I for one, I know the government can't go it alone, because I know that increasingly there are weak and fragmented states, and that we have these powerful corporations that are multilateral, that are all over the place, and that are also contributing, and then at the same time, whether you want to look at it positively or negatively, also positively as well. So how do we get them, to be involved in a more, without compromising? Because is it really bad per se for the Office of the High Commissioner to collect money from Microsoft? If they can be transparent about it, that's fine, and say this is a non-conditional fund, and if you put it, we decide what to do, and you're not going to set conditions for us. Is it bad? Especially when states are not putting their money in funding human rights.
Rolf, please.
No, I mean, seriously, just coming back quickly to this, to the Office of the High Commissioner. I mean, do you know who Microsoft is? I mean, yes, of course, everybody knows who Microsoft is, but there are also some, I mean, it doesn't depend on which company. Sure. But I personally would have difficulties in future to hand over kind of sensitive information about victims and dissidents from states to the Office of the High Commissioner. And if others think this way, this could really destroy. Also, the public reputation out of this, that basically there's a quid pro quo that comes out of this. So what is the payment of the Office of the High Commissioner for Microsoft's money and other money that is coming in? So that, I mean, we have to be clear that states have to control and intergovernmental organizations have to be controlled by the people, not by corporations. And we see that not, I mean, I'm just talking about human rights, but we have to talk about the WHO, we have to talk about the FAO and so on, that face these problems. So I think on question of company accountability to me is an issue for the rule of law. I mean, you have to hold companies accountable before a court, otherwise you will never hold them accountable. What you do is you misuse, in my eyes, human rights for blame and shame campaigns. Okay? I mean, if you address a company with a blame and shame campaign on human rights, you do what has always been done. We have always been blaming and shaming human rights, using sometimes different concepts, but we have been blaming and shaming companies. But that has told us the development, they have got stronger, not weaker. So we have to take a different approach, and that is really using the human rights obligations of states to establish international law to really hold corporations accountable. And the fact that there is such a resistance from the side of not the EU as such, the European Parliament is rather sympathetic to this idea. It's the Commission that speaks out against it. And so I think that shows that we are hitting the nail on the head. And what else is also happening, that there's a solidarization by other states. I mean, the northern, if I could put it this way, get back into the old role of the bad guys when they continue to do this kind of policies. Because the South is hit by the corporations. And they know that in order to control them, they would need that northern states also implement their protect obligations and on an equal level internationally, for which you need a treaty. So I think frankly speaking, no. Transnational corporations, of course, should stand behind human rights, but that is their duty because they are under a constitution, normally established under a constitution that contains human rights. They have no choice. That's why it is kind of ridiculous in the Global Compact that they subscribe to human rights. Yeah, they have no choice. They are legally bound because they are in a system that is based on human rights. And the problem of the system is that there is no applicable, law, operational, no courts, no clear standards. And that is what the treaty wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think we have about 5 minutes left for the session.
There are many people who understand.
Because I haven't seen it.
I give it to the people.
Could I just add one thing here? It's very important to keep in mind that we are now sort of looking at the question of legislation. At the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I was asked to address a major conference, and the topic I was presented with was, is the business of human rights also the business of business? And I answered that question with a resounding yes. The Universal Declaration is universal, but so, in a sense, is also business. So this is a development that we see here, that you go into new areas, and this is what we have to keep in mind. I was involved in legislation, both in the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for many, many years. And the law is never finished. I mean, you work on it all the time, and things happen, and you have to develop the law. And this we have to do also in the field of human rights. And also, I had officers who vetted every legislation proposed before it went from government to parliament with human rights spectacles. I did the same in the United Nations as legal counsel. When we legislated for Kosovo and East Timor, I had an officer reading every draft regulation with the human rights spectacles. And this is a question of implementation. That depending on where you are, the methods may be different. If you legislate, this is a method. If you are sitting in a court, the methods are different. So it's very important to keep this in mind here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to have the last and the final comments, because I really want to sort of to catch on what you were talking about, the World Court, and actually having, as far as I can tell, you want to have the human rights law to change from soft law, in a sense, to hard law. Do you think there will be, because you still need the states to agree to a convention or perhaps a new court like the ICC, which was then happening in an era when we sometimes talk about the 90s as the sort of golden era of human rights. Is it the time, do you think, is it possible today to achieve that again when it comes to, for example, a world court for transnational corporations? Would we need even a world court for other violations of human rights, not only by transnational corporations? And do you think it is actually possible, or what else would you see as the most important issue to sort of stop what is actually seen, perhaps from many of us, as a sort of downplay of the role of human rights in the world today? Would you like to start?
Well,
with?
I think we'll each have about a minute or something. So, to me, again, the world is still mainly ruled by law and by brute force and power, and not rule of law. So, I don't think the international community is willing to come together and do something like an international human rights court, though we should continue to pursue all of these avenues, as I said. One thing I would think we could try to get the 115 or 20 democracies and emerging democracies to agree to is to adopt a resolution in the General Assembly that says that all member states have to conduct their international affairs in accordance with the purposes and principles of the Charter and the letter of the Charter. And I'm really looking at the permanent members of the Security Council who so misuse their veto when they are actually in violation of the letter of the Charter, when they invade countries like the US and the UK did, when they invade another or take over the Crimea, etc. Until the biggest powers are held to the rule of law, you won't get the hard law. That's what will finally get it there. And the last thing is that we need, as human race, we need to make peace with ourselves, we have to make peace with the rest of life on this planet, and we have to make peace with this planet.
Thank you. Rolf?
Well, maybe it's time for a third world conference on human rights. So, actually, one is due next year. And 2018 is 25 years after Vienna, and Vienna was 25 years after Tehran. So now actually, and that was one of the demands of the Vienna Plus 20 conference. Then we got voices who said, be careful. I mean, we will go backward rather than forward. I'm not really convinced. I think without struggling to move forward, we will shift backward automatically. We need an international court on TNCs and human rights. I think to me that is clear, and the treaty is working, perhaps not in the first step, but creating a process moving into that direction. We will see. It depends also on Sweden. I mean, why is the resistance of the EU so strong? Because the countries are just follow what the Commission says. At least officially, what's happening behind the scenes is a secret. Then the World Court on Human Rights, I think that must be very different from the TNC court, because there are very different types of course, you cannot put TNCs and states in the same court. I think it would be a disaster, and that's why although I personally appreciate and I'm friends with Shining and Novak and like the Swiss initiative and all of it, but I think that is a severe mistake. And we have to overcome this, and it has to be a world court, just like the regional courts are. So we have to have states there, and perhaps intergovernmental organizations. That could also be an interesting thing. And intergovernmental organizations act something like international authorities of states, should be at least. And my experience is that you cannot hold them to account unless you come from the outside. I mean, all the internal operational directives and so on don't really work. So you have to be able to sue them just like you'll be able to sue a national states authority. But that could be all discussed at the Third World Conference.
Yeah. Joy?
Thank you. I think in the end also, human rights matter, and the future is in our hands, and we have to give it back to the people. But if human rights is not respected at municipal national level, if they are not implemented by national judges, if they are not recognized at that level, we may decide to have world court, have all kinds of treaty bodies at international level, but people cannot access it. They are just too far removed from people. They will become even too expensive. Today, increasingly, you find people from my continent unable to go to UN, unable to attend any of the UN human rights sessions in Geneva or New York, unable to attend UNGA to see even what their states are saying, even though, yes, we can see webcasts, but they can't even interact and relate. So the emphasis, again, is on effective implementation. We know that states go to ratify these international human rights treaties, and the major ones that have been ratified, they are not even, there is no transformation of that obligation at domestic level. And this, I think, is the legitimate expectation of the people, that when their government sign international treaties, that they should make it applicable at domestic level so that it can have meaning for them. I am up for the World Conference. I am for the World Court. But for now, the emphasis should be on transformation of those international obligations, because they are not self-executing in most cases. Different constitutions have different takes on whether, if you're a money state or dualist state, on whether they apply at domestic level. So you come and argue and say, I have a right under the CEDAW, for example, and a national judge will look at you and say, is this part of our law? And if the answer is no, he said, I cannot implement. So let us make sure that human rights have meaning at community level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a short note here that Sweden is a dualistic country. We have to transform treaties into national law. But we made a very important exemption in 1995. We incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into our national law. And this was a major step, a very important step. Might I add that there is one element that we have not mentioned during this panel, and it is absolutely necessary for future world governance. And I never miss an opportunity of mentioning it, in particular since I'm a senior male citizen. Empowerment of women. Empowerment of women is absolutely necessary. And I can't see the audience here, but I'm sure that there are young men in the audience. Think about this and in the positions you come in the future. And if you look at my website, I have a little sunshine story on how you can work by using specific methods in order to bring forward women in your organization. This can apply in any organization, but I would say this is very important. We should never, ever forget this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Just remember that I said in the beginning I thought we could have a whole forum discussing these issues in the UN. I think I might have been right, because there are so many topics that we could follow up on this maybe for next year. But a great thank you to all of you and for this interesting discussions this morning.